Haggai is a small part of a bigger story. And it is this story that we're going to look at tonight. This is a story that covers over 350 years in history, from around 700 BC all the way to 444 BC. And quite honestly, you could go even wider than that. And as with any story, there are some chapters within. I'm not referring to the 2 chapters of Haggai or the amount of chapters in Ezra. I'm referring to the 9 chapters in these 350 years. These 9 chapters that we're going to go through tonight to introduce ourselves to where Haggai sits in the biblical story, and indeed the historical story. So that at least explains one story. But what are the 5 W's? Are there any guesses out there for what they might be? The 5 Wellers? No. That would be rather interesting to weave that into a Haggai story. No, it is these, if I'm actually on the screen, these 5. Where, when, what, who, and why. Probably not normally said in that order. I don't actually know if there is a specific order, but that will fit with what we're considering tonight. Take particular note of the chosen colours, not because those colours are significant in any way, but that the text on the next 9 slides uses them as a colour code. So if you can somehow retain that colour code in your memory, you're doing very well, although you could probably work it out anyway. Now, my English teacher taught me many years ago that whenever you write a story, you need to consider these 5 W's so you don't miss out on any important information. So we're going to do that tonight. And each of these 9 chapters, we'll look at these 5 W's and in so doing, take a comprehensive understanding of our story. Now, we are going to let the Bible do a lot of the talking tonight, being a story. And the words written within this book do explain that story really well. So we may read a lot of scripture tonight, but I think you'll appreciate with me just how well it all works together. So to start with, come over to 2 Kings 20. We are in Jerusalem in approximately 700 BC. Hezekiah, king of Judah, reigns on the throne, and he's sick, in fact, unto death. Yet, through prayer, our merciful God extends Hezekiah's life by 15 years. In verse 6, Isaiah, God's prophet, speaks God's words to Hezekiah, verse 6, saying, "And I will add unto thy days 15 years, and I will deliver thee and this city out of the hand of the king of Assyria. And I will defend this city for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake." All well and good. Hezekiah seeks a sign from God, and that is when God turns the shadow on the sundial back 10 degrees. But if we jump over to verse 12, we read on. "At that time, Berodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present unto Hezekiah, for he'd heard that Hezekiah had been sick. And Hezekiah hearkened unto them, and showed them all the house of his precious things, the silver and the gold and the spices and the precious ointment, and all the house of his armour, and all that was found in his treasures. There was nothing in his house, nor in all his dominion, that Hezekiah showed them not." Verse 14. "Then came Isaiah the prophet unto King Hezekiah, and said unto him, What said these men? And from whence came they unto thee? Hezekiah said, They are come from a far country, even from Babylon. And he said, What have they seen in thine house? And Hezekiah answered, All the things that are in mine house have they seen. There is nothing among my treasures that I have not showed them. And Isaiah said unto Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days come that all that is in thine house, and that which thy fathers have laid up in store unto this day, shall be carried into Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith Yahweh. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, they shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Verse 19, Then said Hezekiah unto Isaiah, Good is the word of Yahweh which thou hast spoken. And he said, Is it not good if peace and truth be in my days? And that was it. Hezekiah shows the king of Babylon all his wealth, and Isaiah's prophecy predicts at that point the fall of Jerusalem, with all the treasures taken to Babylon, including the sons of Hezekiah, or the descendants of Hezekiah, as eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And although our study isn't to do with Hezekiah, and I'm certainly not an expert in his life or his actions, but that last verse that we read in verse 19, I can't help but read that as that he doesn't show any remorse from what he's done. As if, in fact, it will happen after his reign. That's good enough. I'm okay with that. It's just a side thought that every time I read it, I really can't get my head around that. But we can, at this point, move on to chapter 2. The mention of eunuchs may have brought your mind to Daniel, so turn over to Daniel 1, the first 4 verses. And as you turn that up, we need to understand that we're missing, at this point, in the book of Daniel, about 3 years of history. You see, in about 609 BC, Pharaoh Necho of Egypt, of course, was on his way from Egypt to the Euphrates through Israel to fight in a major war between the 3 major world empires at that time. And it was a war that would determine the shape of the world's map for years to come. Egypt, under the guidance of Pharaoh Necho, was forming an alliance with Assyria to suppress the emerging new rival from Babylon. And thinking back to what we just read, Hezekiah was nearly destroyed by Assyria, but of course God spared Judah from Assyria. And yet now, King Josiah, 3 years before Daniel, the great-grandson of Hezekiah, thinks, I need to stop this alliance, this king with the king of Assyria, because that must be what God wants. He doesn't want Assyria to take over Jerusalem. So Josiah goes up to where Egypt is to fight in what he thinks is God's war, but alas, no. King Josiah is killed by a random arrow, which we know would be directed by God. And King Jehoahaz takes his place. He was appointed by the people, and he lasts a total of 3 months, because Pharaoh Necho decides that King Jehoiakim would be more suited to the role, or at least to serving Pharaoh, because Pharaoh was now in control of the land of Judah. And so King Jehoiakim is now on the throne, and he reigns 11 years. Now, 3 or 4 years later, we come to the Battle of Carchemish, which is a place well north of Israel, somewhere near Haran, near the Euphrates River, or the end of it. And this is where Babylon defeats Egypt and Assyria, despite that alliance. So that was the victory at the Battle of Carchemish. And not only that, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon then gains control of Judea over Egypt, because he pushed Egypt all the way back to their borders that we know now. So King Nebuchadnezzar has invaded Israel for the first time. And now in Daniel 1, we're in that exact moment in history. Verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, so this would be somewhere around 606, 605 BC, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favoured, and skillful in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and who they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And of course, we're then introduced to Daniel and his 3 friends, but that part of the story we don't need to consider. So within 2 chapters of our story, and less than or about 100 years of history, the prophecy from Isaiah about Jerusalem falling indeed fell. Nebuchadnezzar defeats Egypt and Assyria to invade Jerusalem, then successfully takes over Jerusalem. Captives of the king's seed were taken as eunuchs, and some of the vessels of Jerusalem were taken to Babylon. And so we have 70 years captivity beginning. Hold on, you say, what is this about 70 years? So before we go to chapter 3 of our story, let's just take a detour to Jeremiah 25. Okay, Jeremiah 25. I'm going to go to verse 8. Therefore, thus saith Yahweh of hosts, verse 8, Jeremiah 25. Because ye have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith Yahweh, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land, and against the inhabitants thereof, and against all these nations round about, and will utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment and an hissing and perpetual desolations. Verse 11, and this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And it shall come to pass when 70 years are accomplished that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith Yahweh, for their iniquity, and the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it perpetual desolations. Now, believe it or not, this was spoken by Jeremiah, verse 1, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. That was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So we're at the same point in history. You might say, hang on, 3rd year and 4th year, but from what I can tell, it looks like this whole incident occurred over those 2 years, so it took a little while to get through. So we're in the 3rd and 4th year of King Jehoiakim, 606 to 605 BC, and we continue on to chapter 3. Now, I'm going to apologise because you're going straight back to 2nd of Kings, chapter 25 this time. I should have asked to keep your hand there. 2nd of Kings 25. We're now back in Jerusalem in the year 597 BC, which for anyone reasonable at maths and with a good memory, we're about 8 years on. You might also recall King Jehoiakim reigned only 11 years. And 4 plus 8 goes a little bit past 11. So King Jehoiakim has ended his reign about the year before. 2nd of Kings 25, no, I am right, 2nd of Kings 24, starts off in verse 1 with King Jehoiakim being faithful to Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years, then rebelling, and then eventually being deposed by the hand of God within another 4 years. So that would make up your 11. And his son Jehoiachin reigns in his stead at a young and sprightly 18 years old in verse 8, chapter 24. And at this time, in verse 10, Nebuchadnezzar comes against Jerusalem for the 2nd time and besieged it successfully. He takes Jehoiachin and his mother and servants and officers, plus all the treasures of the house of God and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. Or all of this was happening as the Lord had said. And he carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. That concluded the end of verse 14 there. Verse 15, he carried away all these important people, the king, his mother, his officers, away into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon, And then all the men of war also in verse 16 to Babylon. And in verse 17, and the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, his father's brother, king in his stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old and he reigned 11 years. So 2 Kings 24. I was saying 25 that whole time, but it is on the screen correctly. So in summary, in Nebuchadnezzar's second invasion, even more captives and vessels were taken to Babylon, fulfilling the prophecy, if you like, a second time, or partially fulfilling. And the rebellious kings of Judah, starting with King Jehoiakim, were eventually replaced by Nebuchadnezzar with Zedekiah. So Zedekiah is our main king now. And now we do get to chapter 25, with our chapter 4. And Zedekiah doesn't seem to last too long, because at the very end of chapter 24 it says that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Chapter 25, verse 1 to 3. And it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his host, against Jerusalem and pitched against it. And they built forts against it round about. And the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Jehoiakim. And on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine prevailed in the city, and there was no bread for the people of the land. So that came close to 2 whole years of a siege. You can imagine why it's not surprising there was no bread for the people of the land after that time. I think that's commitment from both sides, to be honest. So Nebuchadnezzar comes down in rage, if you like, besieges Jerusalem for 2 years, and when he breaks through, he brutally murders Zedekiah's sons. In verse 7, puts out the eyes of Zedekiah, verse 9, burns the house of Yahweh and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great man's house is burnt with fire. And verse 10, the walls of Jerusalem broken down. Verse 13, the pillars of brass that were in the house of Yahweh, and the bases, and the brazen sea that were in the house of Yahweh did the Chaldees break in pieces, and carried the brass of them to Babylon. And the pots, and the shovels, and the snuffers, and the spoons, and all the vessels of brass wherewith they ministered took they away. And the firepans and the bowls and such things as were of gold, in gold, and of silver in silver, the captain of the guard took away. He just goes everywhere. He takes all the valuable stuff, destroys everything else remaining, and just in case you're not convinced of how brutal and complete this was, the summary of everything that happened is in verse 21, in one line. So Judah was carried away out of their land. The whole of Judah is carried away, and everything that was left is destroyed. So our third invasion by Nebuchadnezzar. Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. Judah taken complete captive. And the second period of 70 years to do with the temple itself begins. We actually in history are able to see 2 lots of 70 years, from the first invasion and from when the temple's destroyed, and we'll see later on where they finish up. Now, I don't know about you, but while I was putting this together, I found this part and the 3 invasions quite hard to consider. It feels like there's nothing positive coming out of this. It's just point after point, everything's being taken away or destroyed. But there is some positive later on, and we do in fact have to zoom forward in history about 50 years to come to chapter 5. So in chapter 5, lots of kings have been deposed and set up, and in fact it's not even Babylon ruling the land anymore. We are in Babylon, but it's actually King Cyrus of Persia who is in control, different nation altogether. And he has something he'd like to say. So if you come over to Ezra chapter 1, and I do promise we're not going out of Ezra after this, but Ezra chapter 1. And in fact, if you do turn there before I manage to, if you look just above, you'll see that the last chapter of 2nd Chronicles also covers what we considered just then. But Ezra chapter 1. What does Cyrus have to say? Verse 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of Yahweh might, by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing. And that little phrase there, in writing, is actually quite important to our story. Verse 2, this is what he said. Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of Yahweh God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem, and whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts, beside the freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. So exactly 70 years after Nebuchadnezzar's first invasion, 605 BC, to the time now in 536 BC, or 535 as well. And the first fall of Jerusalem at the time of Daniel, just realised something, it was 605 or 606 BC, so we are 70 years on. We have the first Jewish captives beginning to return under the authority of Cyrus, king of Persia, just as God had promised, that not only would they return, but it would also be Cyrus. Now this promise was in Isaiah 44. I said don't turn, stay in Ezra, that's fine. But verse 28 says, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. So Cyrus is the one to proclaim, go to Jerusalem and build the temple. So on their return under the assurance of Cyrus, king of Persia, which we just read in Ezra, the Jews responded. They were provided with everything they needed to rebuild God's house. I mean, it was, after all, the reason for his allowance at their return. And of all the people who went into captivity, who were given a new chance at life from the Babylonian system, as many as 50,000 farmers, merchants, priests, Levites, slaves, and musicians, they returned with all their possessions and more under the guidance of Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua, the high priest. Two very important people in our study of Haggai. We'll have the privilege of looking at them next class. And among those who also returned with them were two other men. One was a young priest named Zechariah, who returned with his grandfather, who was one of the senior exiles or senior priests of the exile. And the other was a man possibly more elderly, or probably even, and he was named Haggai. And after the grueling exodus through this barren, dry desert between Babylon and Jerusalem would have taken more than 4 months, 1,500 kilometres, the people finally returned to their hometowns and cities, gradually learning, as you can imagine, to readjust, to settle back into the daily chores of a normal Israelite life: fishing, trading, hunting, herding. Family land was reclaimed, houses were built, the land was farmed. With Zerubbabel acting as their governor and Joshua as the high priest, the people returned with their focus and their trust on God and his ways. Never again were these people, they felt, to fall to the idolatry of the surrounding peoples. They had learned their lesson in that respect. So we can jump forward to Ezra 3 and verse 1, where within several months of their return, it says, the people gathered together, or gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem. Just like in the days of Hezekiah, before the period that we looked at, to rebuild the temple under the direction of Zerubbabel and Joshua, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And in verse 2, the altar of the God of Israel was built to offer burnt offerings thereon. There's a hive of activity. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles is important to mention, so I'll quickly go through the principles shown there. Unfortunately, only quickly. But the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, is in reference to Israel's exodus out of Egypt, where in the first night after the Passover, they stopped at a place called Succoth, which actually is the Hebrew word for tabernacles. And here they erected small shelters using whatever they could find as a reminder of their complete dependence on God. So those flimsy shelters had to protect them from everything around them. And that meant they needed to place their trust in God for salvation, because their salvation at this point wasn't sure. They hadn't quite marched out completely. It was when they had nothing at all, no strength, no plan, no vision. But God wanted them to remember those flimsy booths. He wanted them to see where they had been and where God had brought them. The feast was the final one in the year, according to the law, and it consisted of them bringing the best of their crop to dedicate to their God at the close of the harvest. When they brought in the yearly harvest and saw the multitude of possessions and the abundance of all the things that they had collected, God wanted them to remember that day when really they had nothing but Him. And this basis in the Exodus is essential to understand when we come to look at the story of Haggai and the exiles, especially in our next class. The process of the Exodus is repeated here as the captive Jews return with joy out of a foreign land into the land of promise. So over the following months, they used the money provided them by Cyrus, in verse 7, to hire stonemasons and carpenters in preparation for the temple work. They paid the people of Tyre and Sidon to import cedar wood in a similar fashion to Solomon 440 years earlier. And indeed, we can move on to chapter 6. 5 months after they completed the altar, in 535 BC, the materials were ready, the foundation was laid under the direct supervision of Zerubbabel and Joshua. But the people's response was mixed. The younger generation, not having witnessed Solomon's temple, they were filled with joy and spiritual enthusiasm. This was a great thing. But there were those who saw it and wept. They thought of only what had been, not what could be. And such is this mixed emotion. We read in verse 13 of chapter 3. Many shouted aloud, was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice. Many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off. They couldn't even tell what was joy and what was not. And in chapter 4, when the surrounding Samaritans heard what the Jews were doing, well, they offered their help. Let us build with you. But they were promptly refused by the Jews who returned, who replied, verse 3, "You have nothing to do with us, to build an house unto our God, but we ourselves together will build unto Yahweh, God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, hath commanded us." So, of course, the Samaritans responded by bribing counselors to frustrate the purposes of the Israelites and discouraged them from their work. And this opposition, or this similar pattern would continue even in the reigns of Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes many years later, where similar reconstruction projects were actually successfully stopped. So during these next 15 years, from 535 BC, the Israelites had ceased well and truly to work on the temple. God's house sat neglected. It was just a foundation, unfinished, with no attempt to complete it. The people quickly forgot the work with which they'd begun so enthusiastically. The gathered materials rotted, or indeed were taken by the people for use in their homes. And as their own houses rose and were completed, God's house fell apart, and a famine struck the land. And this pattern we see all too often, a pattern of enthusiasm and joy turned quickly by opposition to apathy and neglect. And the only way to come back to God at these times, sometimes, is we need someone to take the lead, to motivate the people into action. And that's where we get to meet Haggai. And indeed also our reading for tonight. So Ezra chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. Then the prophets, Haggai the prophet, and Zechariah the son of Iddo, prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judah and Jerusalem, in the name of the God of Israel, even unto them. Then rose up Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua the son of Jozadak, and began to build the house of God which is at Jerusalem, and with them were the prophets of God helping them. Just 15 years later, we can work that out from the last verse of chapter 4, the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So again, we're introduced to the two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. We were first introduced to them back with the story of the exiles from Babylon. Now, these prophets were working side by side, but they had a different focus. Haggai's work, which we will learn more of in the next two studies, revolves around getting the people to work on rebuilding the temple of God, while Zechariah's message is about rebuilding the people of God. So from that alone, you can see that their work is extremely close. Both prophets contrast the past with the future, highlighting the need for repentance and change in the people's everyday life, be that through building the temple physically or rebuilding their own spiritual lives. They both use visions of future to bring hope and encourage the people in their work. Now, while Haggai's message is very simple and practical, it is all contained in 2 short chapters. Zechariah's message is many times larger, adding in details and focusing more on the abstract and prophetic aspects of the work. Haggai's message calls the people to be strong and active, while Zechariah gives the people a vision to strengthen them. Both reveal the right attitude and activity that the people of God should engage in every situation in their life, as well as the underlying nature of God's purpose with the earth and with them. So we have now Zerubbabel and Joshua being incited by Haggai and Zechariah to set forward the building of the temple. And no surprise, the opposition comes. Verse 3. At the same time came to Tatnai, governor on this side of the river. Now, Ezra's writing this in Babylon, so Tatnai would be the governor from Babylon on that side of the river. And also Shetharboznai and their companions, and said thus unto them, Who hath commanded you to build this house and to make up this wall? And from the King James, or New King James now, verse 4, Then accordingly we told them the names of the men who were constructing this building. But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, so that they could not make them cease, till a report could go to Darius. Then a written answer was returned concerning this matter. So Tatnai and Shetharboznai could not hinder the Jews. They kept working. And we have the full letter that was sent to Darius in the meantime, and the response back. And in a way, it outlines everything we've already talked about, the whole story of the Jews going to Babylon and back. And in a way, already said that. So, if you haven't been listening, now is the time to listen as we're going to read it. But verse 7, they sent a letter unto him, wherein was written thus, Unto Darius the king, all peace. Be it known unto the king that we went into the province of Judea to the house of the great God, which is builded with great stones, and timber is laid in the walls. This work goeth fast on, and prospereth in their hands. Then we asked those elders, and said unto them thus, Who commanded you to build this house, and to make up these walls? We asked their names also, to certify thee, that we might write the names of the men that were the chief of them. And thus they returned us answer, saying, We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and build the house that was builded these many years ago, which a great king of Israel builded and set up. But after that our fathers had provoked the God of heaven unto wrath. He gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried the people away into Babylon. But in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Babylon, the same king Cyrus made a decree to build this house of God, and the vessels also of gold and of silver of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of Jerusalem, or out of the temple that was in Jerusalem, and brought them into the temple of Babylon. Those did Cyrus the king take out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered unto one, whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor, and said unto him, Take these vessels, go, carry them into the temple that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be builded in his place. Then came the same Sheshbazzar and laid the foundation of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And since that time, even until now, hath it been in building. Yet it is not finished. Now therefore, if it seem good to the king, let there be search made in the king's treasure house, which is there at Babylon, whether it be so, that a decree was made of Cyrus the king to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send his pleasure to us concerning the matter. Now that last point about searching for it to be found, that brings us back to that seemingly insignificant mention in Ezra 1 that I pointed out. Cyrus made this proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing. Can't we see just how God works so beautifully in the kingdoms of men, and even recording those details within the Bible for us to find? Now, of course, the story doesn't end there. We must see how Darius responds. So chapter 6, verse 1 to 12, and I know it's a lot to read, but it's very powerful, I think. Then Darius the king made a decree, and search was made in the house of the rolls, where the treasures were laid up in Babylon. And there was found at Achmetha, in the palace that is in the province of the Medes, a roll, and therein was a record thus written, In the first year of Cyrus the king, the same Cyrus the king made a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be builded, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations thereof be strongly laid, the height thereof 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 80 cubits, with 3 rows of great stones and a row of new timber. And let the expenses be given out of the king's house. And also let the golden and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took forth out of the temple which is at Jerusalem, and brought unto Babylon, be restored, and brought again unto the temple which is at Jerusalem, every one to his place, and place them in the house of God. Now therefore, Tatnai, governor beyond the river, Shetharboznai, and your companions, the Aphasakites, which are beyond the river, be ye far from thence, Let the work of this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in his place. Moreover, I make a decree, what ye shall do to the elders of these Jews for the building of this house of God. That of the king's goods, even of the tribute beyond the river, forthwith expenses be given unto these men, that they be not hindered. And that which they have need of, both young bullocks and rams and lambs, for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and oil, according to the appointment of the priests which are at Jerusalem. Let it be given unto them day by day without fail, that they may offer sacrifices of sweet savours unto the God of heaven, and pray for the life of the king and of his sons. Also I have made a decree, that whosoever shall alter this word, let timber be pulled down from his house, and being set up, let him be hanged thereon, and let the house be made a dunghill for this. And the king and the God that hath caused his name to dwell there destroy all kings and people that shall put to their hand to alter and to destroy this house of God, which is at Jerusalem. I, Darius, have made a decree, let it be done with speed. So this 1 year, we have the whole prophecy of Haggai, the first 2 prophecies of Zechariah, and a decree from the King Cyrus that basically says, get it done. Don't hold back. Now you might think, great, story finished. Well, not quite. There's 1 more chapter, 2 more. A couple years later, in 518 BC, Zechariah proclaims his 3rd prophecy concerning, or covering rather, chapters 7 to 14 of Zechariah. Also something we're not going to consider. Needless to say, though, Zechariah's prophecy is again one of hope and inspiration to the people, encouraging them to lift their eyes that they might see the larger picture and purpose of God. But finally, in 516 BC, the temple is completed, 70 years after it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. The dedication is also celebrated with all of them working together. So we can come to Ezra 6 verse 13 and onwards, and we read that very part. We have enough time. So then Tatnai, governor on this side the river, Shetharboznai and their companions, according to that which Darius the king has sent, so they did speedily. And the elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, and they builded and finished it, according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus, and Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month Adar, which is in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. 4 years later. And the children of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the children of the captivity, kept the dedication of this house of God with joy, and offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bullocks, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and for a sin offering for all Israel, 12 he-goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. And they set the priests in their divisions, and the Levites in their courses for the service of God which is at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. And the children of the captivity kept the Passover upon the 14th day of the 1st month. For the priests and the Levites were purified together. All of them were pure, and killed the Passover for all the children of the captivity, and for their brethren the priests, and for themselves. And the children of Israel which were come again out of captivity, and all such as had separated themselves unto them from the filthiness of the heathen of the land, to seek Yahweh God of Israel, did eat, and kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for Yahweh had made them joyful, and turned the heart of the king of Assyria unto them, to strengthen their hands in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. Fantastic. Such a positive ending to our story. Well, almost, because our last chapter, chapter 9, as we conclude, takes the rest of the Old Testament, from Ezra 7 to Nehemiah 10. We're in Jerusalem, but also in Persia, where Ezra and Nehemiah originally are. And in 457 BC, under Artaxerxes, Ezra returns with 5,000 exiles to rebuild spiritual Israel of law and reform. Seemingly, again, there were some challenges, but the people do overcome and do reform that marital purity in marriage in Ezra 10. And in 444 BC, at the end of our story, Nehemiah also returns with 42,000 to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Again, there is opposition and challenges, but the people band together. They fight to build the walls of Jerusalem, thus bringing Judah back to life and to her land with complete trust in God. And that is where our story ends. So join me in 2 weeks' time to consider 3 men with one purpose as we delve into detail with Haggai I. Thank you.